Today, the subcommittee will pick up where Mr. Bishop of Utah, who served as chairman of the Speaker's Task Force, left off. Our hearing examines the status of federalism in the United States and legislation that Rob Bishop and I have introduced to help spur dialogue and coordinated action on the greatest challenges facing the intergovernmental system. As a former member and chairman of the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors, a county of 1.1 million people, I know how important it is to balance the roles and responsibilities of federal, state, and local governments. I'm also painfully aware of how local government, the most immediate form of government and the level of government where services have to be delivered, can suffer when we fail to strike that right balance. The value proposition of functional intergovernmental relationships is immense. America's federated system demands that federal, state, local, and tribal governments work together and reduce overlap to improve people's lives. The United States Constitution does not give any one level of government absolute power or unlimited jurisdiction over public matters. Therefore, we rely on collaboration across governments to ensure the reliable administration of public services and the protection of the public welfare. A federated system that works and delivers real results for our constituents is as fundamental to our system of governance as free and fair elections. Without either, confidence and trust in our institutions is inevitably diminished. While the Constitution formed a stronger federal government in the wake of the failure of the Articles of Confederation, it also included a respect for the sovereignty of states. To honor the framers' vision, we must remain vigilant about unfunded mandates passed down to state and local governments and push back on overly intrusive federal regulation. In Dillon rule states such as mine, Virginia, where local governments only have the authorities explicitly granted to them by the state government, overreach at the federal and state level can be especially onerous, as local governments are often forced to deal with mandates with their revenue hand tied behind their back. We can all agree that overreach exists. I mentioned the No Child Left Behind Act being a great example. What the intergovernmental relationship needs is a venue for addressing the overreach in a collaborative manner. Our legislation, the Restore the Partnership Act, which we introduced today, would provide such a venue by reconstituting the U.S. Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations, a committee that fosters critical conversations and allows for the sharing of best practices among the leaders of governments that form our nation. We're proud to announce that bipartisan legislation has received already the endorsement of the so-called Big Seven, which includes the National Governors Association, the Council of State Governments, the National Conference of State Legislatures, the National League of Cities, the United States Conference of Mayors, the National Association of Counties, and the International City-County Management Association, all bipartisan organizations. Please indulge a short historical aside which mirrors how the Restore Partnership legislation came about. As Mr. Bishop indicated, in 1953, Congress, with the support of then-President Dwight Eisenhower, authorized the Temporary Commission on Intergovernmental Relations, known as the Kestenbaum Commission, to conduct a review of intergovernmental affairs in the United States. After the Commission published its final report and then sunset, the House Intergovernmental Relations Subcommittee studied and held hearings on those recommendations. Acknowledging the usefulness of the Commission, the subcommittee subsequently developed legislation to establish a permanent successor entity that would have broad jurisdiction over intergovernmental relations. Congress established that successor entity, the ACIR, in September of 1959, when President Eisenhower signed into law legislation that resulted from the work of the subcommittee. The ACIR operated until September of 1996, and during those 37 years, the committee was tasked with serving as both a forum for intergovernmental dialogue and a neutral analytical commission that published reports and guidance on how to create partnerships across different levels of government. It operated much like the modern-day Congressional Budget Office, but remained focused on intergovernmental relations. The ACIR also provided a bipartisan venue for finding solutions to intergovernmental challenges. It brought together representatives of federal, state, local, and tribal governments to promote innovation and collaboration in this space. The ACIR also provided the expertise and analysis necessary for state and local governments to share best practices in fiscal administration and program management. The Commission, unfortunately, was defunded in 1996, not for substantive reasons, but simply as a push to cut federal agencies wherever we could. In retrospect, the decision to abandon the ACIR deprived the federal government of a useful venue and platform for input and pushback on the encroachment of the federal government into state and local affairs. Our legislation seeks to reconstitute an evolved Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. The bill language includes several key reforms to the original ACIR, many of which are recommendations of then-Speaker Ryan's task force chaired by Rob Bishop, which we received from intergovernmental partners and other stakeholders. The reforms to the bill include the addition of town and tribal representatives on the Commission, as well as expanded membership for state legislatures and counties to reach parity with state executive representation. New responsibilities that include examining Supreme Court decisions that impact on the intergovernmental relationship. Actually, a very critical thing by way of addition, because there are a lot of Supreme Court rulings that have lots of impact at the state and local government level. A requirement that Congress hold hearings to examine the Commission's annual report. New authorities that ensure the Commission receives written responses from agencies on the recommendations it provides them. These new provisions generate a new level of accountability and functionality for the Commission, placing it on a par with the way in which federal agencies currently engage with the Government Accountability Office, the GAO. With that, I now recognize my partner on this subcommittee, the former chairman of the subcommittee and now ranking member, Mr. Meadows.